Welcome, friend, to this peaceful hour where we gently peel back the layers of time. Tonight, our story takes place in a world far removed from ours, but still tenderly human. Whether you're drifting off or just looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you're here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, what city or country, and what time it is as you press play. It always amazes me how history can bring strangers together. If this kind of calm historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing. We have many more stories to lull us into the quiet night. The world of medieval street vendors was harsh beyond modern comprehension. These were not the cheerful market traders of romanticized tales, but desperate souls clinging to the very bottom rungs of society's ladder. They lived hand to mouth, quite literally, with each day bringing uncertainty about whether they would earn enough to buy their next meal. Their existence was precarious, their profits meagre, and their social status barely above that of beggars. Thomas begins his day before sunrise, as he has every day for the past 15 years. His small bakery, if it can even be called that, consists of little more than a crude stone oven built into the wall of his single-room dwelling. The space serves as both his workshop and his home, shared with his wife Agnes and their 3 surviving children. 2 other children did not make it past their 2nd year, victims of the diseases and malnutrition that claimed so many young lives in this unforgiving era. The bread Thomas carries is coarse and dark, made from a mixture of rye, barley, and whatever other grains he can afford. When times are particularly hard, which they often are, he stretches his meagre flour supply with additives that would horrify modern consumers. Ground acorns, sawdust, and even chalk find their way into his dough, not out of malice, but out of desperate necessity. These adulterants help bulk up his loaves, allowing him to sell more bread and hopefully earn enough to buy ingredients for tomorrow's batch. The streets Thomas navigates are treacherous obstacle courses of mud, refuse, and human waste. Medieval towns had no organized system of garbage collection or sewage disposal. People simply threw their waste into the streets, where it mixed with animal droppings from the horses, pigs, and chickens that shared the urban spaces with humans. When it rained, which it often did in the damp climate of Northern Europe, these streets became rivers of filth that could reach up to a person's ankles. As Thomas makes his rounds, he must compete with dozens of other vendors, each fighting for the attention of potential customers. The competition is fierce and sometimes violent. Vendors jealously guard their regular customers and their selling spots, and disputes over territory can quickly escalate into physical confrontations. The weak and elderly are often pushed aside by younger, stronger competitors, forced to accept the least desirable locations where foot traffic is minimal. The authorities offer little protection for these humble merchants. In fact, they are often seen as a nuisance by city officials who view street vendors as contributors to the chaos and disorder of urban life. Regulations are numerous and constantly changing, designed more to extract fees and fines than to provide any real structure or protection. Thomas must navigate a bewildering maze of rules about where he can sell, what he can sell, and how much he can charge. The guild system, which provided some protection and regulation for established craftsmen, offered no such benefits to street vendors. These merchants operated outside the formal economy, without the backing of powerful organizations or wealthy patrons. They were truly on their own, vulnerable to the whims of customers, competitors, and authorities alike. Agnes, Thomas's wife, plays a crucial role in their survival. While Thomas sells bread in the streets, she tends to their small herb garden behind their dwelling, growing whatever vegetables can survive in the poor soil and harsh climate. She also keeps a few scrawny chickens, though the eggs they produce are too valuable to eat and must be sold to supplement the family's meagre income. In the evenings, Agnes spins wool by candlelight, creating thread that she can sell to cloth merchants for a few precious coins. The couple's children begin working almost as soon as they can walk. The oldest, a boy of 10 named Edmund, helps his father carry bread through the streets and serves as a lookout for potential thieves or hostile competitors. The two younger children, both girls, help their mother with the garden and the chickens and spend their days collecting scraps of wood and dried dung for fuel. Education is an impossible luxury for children like these. Reading and writing are skills reserved for the wealthy and the clergy, and Thomas and Agnes themselves are completely illiterate. They conduct their business through verbal agreements and trust, with no written contracts or records to protect them from dishonest customers or suppliers. The seasonal nature of medieval life adds another layer of difficulty to the street vendor's existence. Summer brings longer days and more opportunities to sell, but it also brings intense heat that causes bread to spoil quickly. Thomas must time his sales carefully, knowing that unsold bread becomes worthless within hours of baking. Winter presents different challenges, with shorter days limiting selling time and bitter cold making it nearly impossible to stand in the streets for extended periods. During harvest time, the streets fill with farmers bringing their produce to market, creating both opportunities and intense competition for urban vendors. Thomas might be able to purchase grain directly from farmers at slightly better prices, but he must compete with established bakers and wealthy merchants who can afford to buy in much larger quantities. Religious festivals and market days bring crowds of potential customers, but they also attract vendors from surrounding villages and towns, flooding the market with competitors. On these busy days, Thomas might earn enough to feed his family well for several days, but such windfalls are rare and unpredictable. The constant threat of theft hangs over every street vendor. Thieves target them not only for their goods, but also for any coins they might have earned during the day. Thomas has learned to hide his money in various places throughout his clothing, and to vary his routes to avoid establishing predictable patterns that criminals might exploit. He has been robbed 3 times in the past 5 years, losing not only his day's earnings, but also his entire stock of bread, forcing his family to go hungry for days. Disease poses another constant threat. The unsanitary conditions of medieval streets provide perfect breeding grounds for illnesses that spread rapidly through crowded urban areas. Thomas has survived 2 major plague outbreaks that devastated his town, killing many of his fellow vendors and customers. Each epidemic brings not only the fear of death, but also economic disaster, as people avoid the streets and markets where disease might lurk. The quality of ingredients available to street vendors like Thomas is often questionable at best. Grain merchants frequently sell moldy or contaminated products to small buyers who lack the leverage to demand better quality. Thomas has learned to inspect his purchases carefully, but even his experienced eye sometimes misses signs of spoilage that will become apparent only after he has baked his bread and attempted to sell it. Storage presents another significant challenge. Thomas's small dwelling offers little protection from moisture, rodents, and insects that can quickly destroy his precious ingredients. He has built crude wooden boxes to store his flour and other supplies, but these provide only minimal protection. Rats are a constant problem, not only consuming his ingredients but also contaminating them with their droppings and urine. The tools of Thomas's trade are simple and crude by modern standards. His wooden tray, carved by his own hands from a piece of driftwood found by the river, serves as both display case and carrying device for his bread. A small knife, carefully maintained and sharpened on stones, helps him cut loaves for customers who cannot afford whole pieces. A worn leather pouch holds his meager earnings, and a piece of rough cloth protects his bread from rain and dust. Weather plays a crucial role in determining Thomas's daily success or failure. Rain drives potential customers indoors and can ruin his bread before he has a chance to sell it. Strong winds can scatter his goods and make it impossible to maintain his small display. Snow and ice make the already treacherous streets even more dangerous and reduce foot traffic to a trickle. Even sunny weather brings challenges, as the heat can cause his bread to become stale and unappetizing within hours. The relationship between street vendors and their customers is complex and often fraught with tension. Customers, many of whom are themselves struggling with poverty, drive hard bargains and frequently attempt to negotiate prices downward. They inspect bread carefully for signs of spoilage or adulteration, and any defect can result in a refused sale and wasted effort. Credit is rarely extended, as both parties understand that poverty makes repayment uncertain. Thomas must also navigate the complex social hierarchies of medieval society. When wealthy customers approach, he must show proper deference, removing his cap and addressing them with appropriate titles. Failure to show proper respect can result not only in lost sales, but also in complaints to authorities that might lead to fines or other punishments. At the same time, he must be assertive enough to protect his interests and ensure that he receives fair payment for his goods. The legal system offers little protection for street vendors who find themselves in disputes with customers or competitors. Courts heavily favour those with wealth and social standing, and a poor baker's word carries little weight against that of a prosperous merchant or minor noble. Thomas has learned to avoid legal entanglements whenever possible, even when he has been clearly wronged, because the costs and risks of pursuing justice far outweigh any potential benefits. Seasonal festivals and religious holidays present both opportunities and challenges for street vendors. While these occasions bring crowds of potential customers with money to spend, they also attract additional competition from vendors who travel from other towns and villages. The authorities often impose special taxes and fees during these events, eating into already thin profit margins. Religious restrictions on certain types of work or commerce during holy days can also limit selling opportunities. The physical toll of street vending is enormous. Thomas spends most of his day on his feet, walking miles through difficult terrain while carrying heavy loads. His back aches constantly from bending over his tray and lifting sacks of flour. His hands are permanently stained and cracked from handling dough and working with rough materials. The constant exposure to weather has left his face weathered and prematurely aged, making him look older than his 35 years. Sleep is often elusive for Thomas and his family. Their small dwelling offers little protection from cold, noise, and the various unpleasant odors that permeate medieval urban life. The straw that serves as their bedding is infested with fleas and other insects that make rest difficult. Worry about the next day's business keeps Thomas awake many nights, as he mentally calculates how much bread he can afford to bake with his remaining ingredients, and whether he will earn enough to purchase supplies for the following day. The social isolation experienced by street vendors adds another dimension to their hardship. Their low status in society means they have few friends or allies among the more established members of the community. Other vendors are competitors rather than companions, and customers view them with suspicion and often contempt. The clergy, while preaching charity and compassion, rarely extend genuine friendship or support to those they consider beneath their station. Despite all these challenges, Thomas continues his daily struggle because he has no viable alternatives. He lacks the capital to establish a proper bakery, the connections to join a guild, or the education to pursue other trades. Street vending, harsh as it is, represents his only means of survival in a world that offers few opportunities for social mobility. Each day, he rises before dawn, lights his oven, and begins the process anew, driven by the basic human need to provide for his family and maintain some shred of dignity in an undignified world. The story of Thomas the Baker represents just one example of the countless street vendors who struggled to survive in medieval Europe. From fishmongers selling their catch in coastal towns, to cloth merchants peddling their wares in mountain villages. These humble traders formed the backbone of medieval commerce, while living lives of extraordinary hardship and uncertainty. Their struggles illuminate the harsh realities of daily life. For the vast majority of people in an era that is often romanticized in popular culture, but was, in reality, brutally unforgiving for those at the bottom of society's hierarchy. Based on the reference materials provided, here's part 2 of the harsh lives of medieval street vendors. Yet the perils facing these street vendors extended far beyond the simple challenge of making a sale. Disease stalked the crowded marketplaces like an invisible predator, ready to claim the unwary. The very air they breathed was thick with pestilence. In the narrow, winding streets where vendors hawked their wares, refuse piled in festering heaps between cobblestones. Human waste flowed openly through crude gutters, mingling with animal droppings and rotting food scraps to create a noxious soup that bred illness. Vendors like Margaret the fishmonger worked from dawn to dusk, surrounded by the stench of decay. Her modest stall, wedged between a blacksmith's forge and a tanner's workshop, reeked of fish that had begun to turn in the summer heat. Without any means of refrigeration, Margaret fought a losing battle against time itself. The cod and herring she purchased at dawn would grow increasingly rank as the day wore on, their scales dulling and their flesh softening in the merciless sun. Each morning, Margaret would examine her remaining stock from the previous day, carefully trimming away the worst of the spoilage and arranging the least offensive specimens at the front of her display. The art of selling deteriorating fish required a delicate balance of honesty and survival. Too truthful about the quality, and she would starve. Too deceptive, and she risked the wrath of customers who might return seeking retribution for their ruined meals. The threat of contamination hung over every transaction. Flies swarmed the market stalls in black clouds, settling indiscriminately on food, faces, and festering wounds. Rats scurried boldly between the vendors' feet, growing fat on the endless supply of dropped morsels and spoiled goods. These creatures served as unwitting harbingers of the Black Death and countless other maladies that periodically swept through medieval cities like scythes through wheat. Street vendors found themselves particularly vulnerable to these outbreaks. Their work demanded constant contact with the public, handling coins that had passed through countless unwashed hands, breathing air thick with the exhalations of the masses. When plague struck a community, the marketplace often became ground zero for its spread. Vendors who survived such outbreaks frequently found their customer base decimated, their already precarious livelihoods hanging by an even thinner thread. The seasonal nature of their trade added another layer of uncertainty to their existence. William the fruit seller knew that his fortunes rose and fell with the rhythms of harvest and scarcity. Spring brought the promise of fresh produce, but also the lean months when winter stores had dwindled and new crops had yet to ripen. During these hungry times, William might find himself selling wizened apples and sprouting onions to customers whose coin purses had grown as thin as their bodies. Summer offered abundance, but also fierce competition. When orchards burst with fruit and gardens overflowed with vegetables, the market became a battlefield where vendors undercut each other's prices in desperate attempts to move their perishable inventory. William watched helplessly as perfect pears rotted in his baskets, while customers haggled over pennies they could ill afford to spend. Autumn brought the harvest rush, a frenzied period when vendors worked themselves to exhaustion processing and preserving the year's bounty. This was when fortunes were made or lost, when a successful season might provide enough coin to weather the coming winter, or when disaster might spell starvation for an entire family. William spent these crucial months transforming fresh fruit into dried goods, trading immediate profit for the promise of sales during the barren months ahead. Winter was perhaps the cruelest season of all. With fresh produce a distant memory, vendors like William subsisted on selling preserved goods at inflated prices to customers who could barely afford them. The cold seeped through inadequate clothing, numbing fingers and making the simple act of counting coins an ordeal. Snow and ice made the already treacherous streets nearly impassable, reducing foot traffic to a trickle of the most desperate shoppers. The psychological toll of such an existence cannot be understated. These vendors lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, never knowing whether the next day would bring profit or loss, sustenance or starvation. Sleep came fitfully to those who spent their days balanced on the knife's edge of survival. Dreams were haunted by visions of empty stalls and angry customers, of debts unpaid and families unfed. Yet perhaps most crushing of all was the complete absence of any social safety net. When illness struck, when injury prevented work, when age finally bent the back beyond repair, there was nowhere to turn. The guilds that protected established craftsmen had no interest in the welfare of lowly street vendors. The church, while occasionally dispensing charity, could hardly feed the multitudes of destitute souls that crowded medieval cities. Family members often became economic units rather than sources of comfort. Children were pressed into service as soon as they could walk, tasked with running errands, minding stalls, or working as lookouts for approaching authorities. Wives bore the double burden of helping with the family trade while managing households on impossibly meagre resources. The elderly, no longer able to contribute to the family's survival, became burdens that strained already overtaxed resources. The legal system offered no protection for these marginalized vendors. Courts were the province of the wealthy and well-connected, not the haunt of those who sold goods from pushcarts and makeshift stalls. Justice, when it existed at all, was swift and brutal. A vendor accused of cheating customers might find themselves in the stocks, their goods confiscated, and their reputation destroyed. The presumption of innocence was a luxury reserved for those who could afford legal representation. Even death offered no dignity to these forgotten souls. Street vendors who perished from disease, exhaustion, or violence were often buried in unmarked graves, their passing noted by none save the family members left to continue the struggle for survival. Their life's work vanished without trace, their accumulated knowledge of trade and survival dying with them. The winter of 1347 proved particularly harsh for the vendors of London's markets. Robert the grain seller watched helplessly as his customers grew fewer with each passing day. The previous summer's harvest had been poor, and what grain remained commanded prices that placed it beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest citizens. Robert found himself in the impossible position of needing to eat his own inventory to survive, while simultaneously preserving it to generate the income necessary for survival. As the cold deepened and snow began to fall with increasing frequency, Robert noticed changes in his remaining customers that filled him with dread. They moved more slowly, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow with hunger. Some bore the telltale signs of scurvy, their gums bleeding and their teeth loosening from malnutrition. Others showed the swollen limbs and distended bellies that marked them as victims of dropsy, their bodies retaining fluid in a desperate attempt to preserve life. But it was the children who broke Robert's heart most completely. Little ones who should have been playing and laughing instead moved like ancient souls, their growth stunted by chronic hunger and their eyes holding a weariness that belonged to no child. They clutched at their parents' hands with desperate intensity, as if sensing that their hold on life itself was equally tenuous. The arrival of spring brought no relief, only different forms of suffering. The first ships from foreign ports carried more than exotic goods in their holds. Rats scurried down mooring lines, their fleas heavy with a disease that would soon earn the name Black Death. Within weeks, the bustling marketplaces of medieval cities became charnel houses, where the living stepped carefully around the bodies of the dead. For those street vendors who survived the initial onslaught of plague, the world that emerged from that devastation was both opportunity and nightmare. With so many dead, competition for customers decreased dramatically. But the customers themselves had become a source of mortal terror. Every transaction carried the risk of contagion. Every coin potentially bore the touch of death. The social fabric of medieval society, already strained by centuries of inequality and hardship, began to unravel completely. Street vendors found themselves among the few willing to venture into plague-ravaged neighborhoods, delivering food and supplies to those too terrified or too ill to leave their homes. This essential service came at a horrific cost, as vendor after vendor succumbed to the very disease they had risked everything to combat. Those who survived did so through a combination of luck, isolation, and the kind of grim determination that had sustained their class through generations of hardship. They had learned to expect nothing from life, save what they could wrest from it through their own efforts. In a world where death could strike without warning, and justice was a luxury beyond their means, medieval street vendors developed a resilience that bordered on the supernatural. Their legacy lives on, not in grand monuments or written histories, but in the genetic memory of struggle that courses through the veins of all who work for daily bread. They remind us that prosperity is fragile, that security is often illusory, and that the distance between civilization and chaos can be measured in the span of a single failed harvest or the arrival of a single plague ship. In examining their lives, we see reflected not just the harsh realities of medieval existence, but the fundamental human capacity to endure, to hope, and to continue the essential work of living, even when that work offers little reward beyond the promise of another day's survival. Based on the reference materials provided, here's part 3 of The Harsh Lives of Medieval Street Vendors. As dawn broke over the cramped quarters of medieval cities, a different kind of desperation stirred among those who had no fields to till or workshops to call their own. These were the street vendors, the most precarious of all medieval labourers, whose very survival depended on their ability to hawk whatever meagre wares they could scrape together in the narrow, filth-strewn alleys of urban centres. Unlike the peasants bound to their lord's estate, or the craftsmen protected by their guilds, street vendors existed in a twilight world of commerce, operating without the safety nets that others, however meagre, might enjoy. They were the economic outcasts, the desperate souls who turned to the streets when all other avenues had closed, carrying their entire livelihood in a wooden tray, a cloth bundle, or a rickety cart that might collapse at any moment. Consider the plight of Margot, a widow whose husband had perished in one of the endless wars that plagued the countryside. With no land to inherit and no male relatives to provide for her, she found herself cast into the unforgiving world of street commerce. Each morning, she would rise before the cathedral bells rang for matins, gathering whatever scraps she could afford to purchase from the wholesale merchants who controlled the city's food supply. A few turnips past their prime, perhaps some barley that had been rejected by the bakers, or if fortune smiled upon her, a handful of eggs from chickens too old to lay regularly. The mathematics of street vending were brutally simple and utterly unforgiving. Margot might spend her last few copper coins purchasing goods at dawn, only to discover that 3 other vendors had secured the same items and were selling them at the same busy intersection. Competition was not merely fierce, it was existential. Every customer who chose her rival's turnips over hers meant another step closer to starvation. The locations where vendors could ply their trade were severely limited and jealously guarded. The prime spots near the cathedral doors, the market squares, and the gates where travellers entered the city were controlled by established merchants who paid fees to the city authorities for the privilege. Street vendors were relegated to the margins, quite literally, forced to hawk their wares in the shadowy spaces between legitimate commerce. They clustered in the narrow alleyways, beneath the overhanging upper stories of houses, or in the muddy areas near the city walls, where the smell from the latrines was so overwhelming that even the poor avoided lingering. These marginal locations came with their own perils. The spaces between buildings were often the domain of cutthroats and thieves, who viewed the vendors as easy targets. A street vendor carrying the day's earnings, however modest, might find themselves set upon by desperate souls even more destitute than themselves. The City Watch, such as it was, rarely ventured into these shadowy corners, and when they did, it was often to shake down the vendors themselves for bribes, rather than to provide protection. The goods that street vendors sold told the story of medieval urban poverty in miniature. They offered the scraps and leftovers that the established merchants couldn't or wouldn't sell. Bread that had hardened beyond palatability might be hawked as trencher bread for those too poor to afford fresh loaves. Vegetables that were beginning to rot could be sold to desperate customers who would cut away the spoiled portions and make do with what remained. Sometimes vendors would purchase the intestines, feet, and organs that butchers discarded, boiling them into a thin soup that could be sold to labourers who had no time or means to prepare their own meals. The seasonal nature of medieval commerce meant that street vendors faced periods of absolute destitution. During the harsh winter months, when fresh produce disappeared entirely and the city's population huddled indoors, vendors might go days without making a single sale. Unlike the peasants who could at least retreat to their hovels and subsist on stored grain, or the craftsmen who could work by firelight in their workshops, street vendors had no shelter from the economic storms that periodically swept through medieval cities. Many vendors supplemented their meagre income through activities that existed in the grey areas between legal commerce and outright crime. They might serve as unofficial messengers, carrying news and gossip between different quarters of the city for a few copper coins. Some acted as procurers, helping travellers find lodging or services, taking a small cut from any transactions they facilitated. Others ventured into the countryside surrounding the city, gathering wild herbs, mushrooms, or berries that they could sell to urban dwellers who had no access to such things. The relationship between street vendors and the established merchant class was one of barely concealed hostility. Guild merchants viewed the vendors as unfair competition who undercut their prices and diluted the value of their carefully controlled trades. They lobbied city authorities constantly to crack down on street vending, arguing that unlicensed sellers were a threat to public health and civic order. These efforts often succeeded, resulting in periodic sweeps where city officials would confiscate vendors' goods and impose fines that could devastate families already living on the edge of survival. Yet despite their official disapproval, even guild merchants found uses for the street vendor network. When a merchant had goods that were slightly damaged or past their prime, selling them through street vendors allowed them to recoup some value without damaging their own reputation. This created a complex web of interdependence, where vendors served as an unofficial outlet for the waste and overflow of the legitimate economy, while being simultaneously persecuted by those same legitimate businesses. The health hazards faced by street vendors were extraordinary, even by medieval standards. Spending long hours in the open air exposed them to every weather extreme, from the scorching heat of summer to the bitter cold of winter. The goods they handled were often of questionable quality to begin with, and the primitive preservation methods of the era meant that vendors were constantly exposed to spoiled food and contaminated water. Many developed chronic illnesses from their constant exposure to the elements and poor quality provisions. The social isolation of street vendors was perhaps as devastating as their economic precarity. Unlike peasants who lived in small communities where everyone knew their neighbours, or craftsmen who belonged to guilds that provided both professional identity and social connection, street vendors existed on the margins of urban society. They were too poor to participate in the religious festivals and celebrations that bound communities together, too transient to form lasting relationships, and too desperate to trust even their fellow vendors, who were, after all, direct competitors for the same limited pool of customers. Children born into families of street vendors faced particularly grim prospects. From the moment they could walk, they were pressed into service helping their parents hawk goods, standing for hours in all weather, holding baskets, or calling out to potential customers. Education was utterly beyond their reach, not merely because their families couldn't afford it, but because every moment spent learning letters or numbers was a moment not spent earning the coins that meant the difference between eating and starving. These children learned early that survival meant being constantly alert to opportunity and danger. They developed an acute sense of reading people's faces and moods, knowing instantly which potential customers might have coins to spend and which were likely to drive them away with curses or blows. Many became accomplished pickpockets and petty thieves, skills that their parents tacitly encouraged even as they officially disapproved, knowing that sometimes theft was the only thing standing between their family and starvation. The legal status of street vendors was precarious in the extreme. They operated without licenses or official sanction, which meant they had no recourse when customers cheated them or when other vendors stole their goods. City courts, when they functioned at all, were designed to serve the interests of established merchants and property owners. A street vendor who brought a complaint against a guild merchant or a member of the nobility would likely find themselves facing countercharges of vagrancy or disturbing the peace. This legal vulnerability made vendors easy targets for corruption and extortion. City officials, both legitimate and corrupt, regularly demanded bribes in exchange for the right to operate in certain areas or during certain times. These unofficial taxes further eroded the vendors' already razor-thin profit margins, but refusing to pay often meant being driven away from the best-selling locations or having one's goods confiscated on trumped-up charges. The religious life of street vendors reflected their marginal social status. While the medieval church preached charity and care for the poor, in practice, vendors found themselves excluded from much of the spiritual community. They couldn't afford the donations expected at religious services, couldn't spare the time for lengthy masses when every hour away from selling meant lost income, and often felt unwelcome in churches where the established merchants and craftsmen made their disapproval known. Yet faith remained important to many vendors, perhaps because it offered one of the few sources of hope in their otherwise bleak existence. They developed their own informal religious practices, saying quick prayers over their goods in the hope of attracting customers, crossing themselves when they made a sale, and invoking various saints who were believed to protect merchants and traders. Some carried small religious tokens or amulets, believing these would bring them luck or protect them from the many dangers of street life. The cycles of feast and famine that marked medieval life hit street vendors with particular severity. During religious festivals or market days, when the city filled with visitors and pilgrims, vendors might experience brief periods of relative prosperity as demand for their goods increased. But these peak times were followed inevitably by long stretches of minimal sales, and vendors had to carefully manage their earnings to survive the lean periods. The feast days presented their own challenges, however. The increased competition from temporary vendors who flooded the city during festivals meant that regular street vendors often found themselves pushed out of their usual selling spots by newcomers who had more capital or better connections. The irony was bitter. The very occasions that should have brought prosperity instead often brought increased hardship as the market became oversaturated with sellers competing for customers' limited coins. Weather was another constant enemy of the street vendor. Rain could ruin perishable goods in minutes, while extreme heat could spoil food before it could be sold. Snow and ice made the already treacherous city streets nearly impassable, while driving wind could scatter lightweight goods or extinguish the small fires that vendors used to cook prepared foods. Unlike merchants with permanent shops, vendors had no shelter for themselves or their wares, making them completely vulnerable to the whims of nature. The tools of the street vendors' trade were as humble as they were essential. A wooden tray or basket, perhaps a small cart if they were fortunate enough to afford one, a few pieces of cloth to display goods or protect them from the elements, and a leather pouch to hold the precious few coins that represented their entire fortune. These simple implements represented major investments for people living in such poverty, and their loss or destruction could spell complete disaster. Many vendors were forced to rent even these basic tools, paying daily fees to more prosperous individuals who had accumulated enough capital to invest in such equipment. This arrangement trapped vendors in a cycle of debt and dependency, where much of their daily earnings went to tool rental, leaving them unable to accumulate the capital needed to purchase their own equipment and escape the trap. The network of relationships that sustained street vendors was complex and fragile. Vendors often formed loose alliances with others who sold complementary goods, sharing information about where customers might be found or which areas to avoid due to increased enforcement activity. But these relationships were always strained by the reality that ultimately, every vendor was competing with every other vendor for the same limited pool of customers. Some vendors specialized in serving particular communities within the city. Those who could speak multiple languages might focus on selling to foreign merchants or pilgrims, while others developed expertise in the specific needs of certain neighborhoods or professional groups. This specialization could provide some protection from competition, but it also made vendors vulnerable to changes in their chosen market segment. The evening hours brought their own particular challenges for street vendors. As darkness fell and the legitimate businesses closed their doors, the streets became increasingly dangerous. Vendors who hadn't sold their perishable goods during the day faced the agonizing choice of trying to sell them at drastically reduced prices in the growing darkness, or accepting a total loss. Many vendors spent their evenings going door to door in the poorer neighborhoods, hoping to find customers who might purchase day-old bread or slightly spoiled produce at reduced prices. The constant stress of this precarious existence took a severe toll on the physical and mental health of street vendors. The combination of poor nutrition, exposure to the elements, and the relentless anxiety of never knowing where the next meal would come from created a population that aged rapidly and died young. Many vendors developed chronic coughs from breathing the polluted air of medieval cities, while others suffered from malnutrition-related diseases that sapped their strength and clouded their judgment. Yet despite all these hardships, the street vendors served a crucial function in the medieval urban economy. They provided a distribution network for goods that might otherwise go to waste. They served customers who couldn't afford the prices charged by established merchants, and they offered a form of economic activity for those who had been excluded from the formal structures of medieval commerce. In their own way, they were pioneers of what we might now call the informal economy, creating value and serving needs through sheer determination and ingenuity. The stories of individual vendors, when they survive in historical records at all, reveal both the crushing poverty and the remarkable resilience of these forgotten merchants. They speak of women who raised children while balancing baskets of goods on their heads, of men who walked miles each day to find customers for their wares, of families who shared single rooms with their inventory and counted each copper coin as if it were gold. As the medieval period drew to a close and new forms of commerce began to emerge, the street vendors found themselves facing new challenges and opportunities. The growth of towns and the increasing sophistication of trade networks created new markets for their services, but also brought increased regulation and competition. Some vendors managed to accumulate enough capital to establish permanent shops or join guilds, while others found themselves pushed even further to the margins as the formal economy expanded and consolidated. The legacy of medieval street vendors lives on in the informal markets and street commerce that continue to flourish in cities around the world. Their story reminds us that throughout history, there have always been those who survived by their wits and determination, creating livelihoods from nothing more than the courage to stand in the street and offer their wares to passers-by. In their struggles and their small triumphs, we see reflected the eternal human drive to survive and prosper, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Looking at your summary and the reference materials, I'll continue the script from where Part 3 left off. Here's Part 4. The relentless cycle of labor and scarcity that defined medieval street vendor life was further complicated by the constant threat of violence and theft that lurked in every shadowed alleyway and crowded marketplace. Unlike the organized merchants who enjoyed the protection of guilds and the security of established shops, street vendors were perpetually vulnerable, carrying their entire livelihood in baskets and carts that could be overturned or ransacked in an instant. Consider the plight of Agnes, a fishmonger who rose each morning before dawn to purchase her wares from the boats returning to harbour. With barely enough coin to buy a day's worth of fish, she had no choice but to extend credit from the fishermen, promising payment at day's end when her sales were complete. This precarious arrangement left her doubly vulnerable. If thieves made off with her basket, or if the fish spoiled in the heat before she could sell them, Agnes faced not only the loss of her day's income, but also mounting debts that could spiral beyond her ability to repay. The medieval streets offered little protection for such vulnerable merchants. City guards, when they existed at all, were primarily concerned with protecting the interests of established merchants and maintaining order around major market squares. The narrow, winding lanes where street vendors often conducted their trade were largely lawless territories where might made right. Gangs of youths, desperate beggars, and petty criminals knew that a lone vendor with a cart full of goods presented an easy target. Violence against street vendors took many forms, from the swift grab-and-run theft of a few items to more organized raids that could destroy a vendor's entire stock. Some criminals specialized in targeting specific types of vendors. Bread sellers, for instance, were often robbed not just for the value of their goods, but because bread was immediately consumable and could feed a hungry thief or be quickly resold. Vendors selling small, valuable items like spices or metalwork faced constant threats from pickpockets and cut purses who could slip valuable merchandise into their clothes and disappear into the crowd. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance was enormous. Street vendors developed an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings, constantly scanning the crowd for potential threats while simultaneously trying to attract customers. They learned to read the subtle signs that might indicate trouble brewing, the way certain individuals move through the crowd, the positioning of groups that might be planning a coordinated theft, the times of day when criminal activity was most likely to occur. Many vendors developed elaborate strategies to protect themselves and their goods. Some would form informal partnerships, watching each other's stalls during brief absences and creating networks of mutual protection. Others invested in guard dogs, though feeding an animal was yet another expense that strained their meager resources. The more successful vendors might hire a young apprentice or family member to serve as both helper and protector, though this too represented a significant financial burden. The seasonal nature of much street vending created additional security challenges. During busy market days or religious festivals, when the potential for sales was highest, the crowds also provided better cover for thieves and pickpockets. Vendors found themselves caught in a terrible dilemma. The very conditions that offered the best opportunity for profit also exposed them to the greatest risk of robbery and violence. Women vendors faced particular dangers, as they were often seen as easier targets for both theft and assault. Female street sellers developed their own protective strategies, often dressing in ways that concealed their gender, or traveling in groups for safety. Some carried hidden weapons, small knives or sharpened tools that could serve double duty as implements of their trade and means of self-defense. The legal system offered little recourse for victims of street crime. Even when thieves were caught, the lengthy and expensive process of bringing them to justice was often beyond the means of a struggling street vendor. Courts typically favored established merchants and guild members over itinerant sellers, and the testimony of a lowly street vendor carried little weight against that of a respectable citizen. This constant threat of violence created an atmosphere of fear and mistrust that permeated every aspect of street vendor life. Vendors were suspicious not only of obvious threats, but also of potential customers who might be casing their goods for later theft. The need to remain constantly alert and defensive inevitably affected their ability to be friendly and welcoming to legitimate buyers, creating a vicious cycle that could harm their business prospects. The economic impact of crime against street vendors extended far beyond the immediate loss of goods. A single major theft could wipe out weeks or months of accumulated profit, forcing vendors to borrow money at usurious rates or sell family possessions to restock their inventory. Some vendors were driven out of business entirely by a succession of thefts, joining the ranks of the unemployed poor who themselves might turn to crime to survive. Weather presented another constant adversary for medieval street vendors, one that was as predictable as it was devastating. Unlike modern merchants who conduct business in climate-controlled environments, street vendors were entirely at the mercy of the elements, watching helplessly as rain, snow, wind, and extreme temperatures destroyed their goods and drove away their customers. Rain was perhaps the most immediate and frequent threat. A sudden downpour could ruin a day's worth of bread, dissolve carefully prepared foods, and damage textiles beyond repair. Vendors who sold paper goods, prepared foods, or anything that could be damaged by moisture lived in constant fear of the changing sky. Many developed elaborate systems of coverings and shelters, but these were often inadequate against a truly severe storm. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created periods of abundance and scarcity that street vendors had to navigate with skill and foresight. Summer brought the possibility of fresh produce and increased foot traffic, but also the challenge of keeping perishable goods from spoiling in the heat. Winter offered relief from spoilage, but brought new challenges as frozen goods became unsellable and potential customers remained huddled indoors. Snow and ice created treacherous conditions that made it difficult for vendors to transport their goods and dangerous for customers to venture out to make purchases. The narrow, unpaved streets of medieval towns became muddy quagmires in wet weather and frozen obstacles in winter, making the already difficult task of moving heavy carts and baskets nearly impossible. Extreme heat posed particular challenges for vendors selling food items. Without refrigeration, meat, dairy products, and prepared foods could spoil within hours during hot summer days. Vendors learned to time their purchases and sales carefully, buying only what they could sell before spoilage set in. But this limited their ability to take advantage of bulk purchasing discounts or to build up inventory during slow periods. Wind could be equally destructive, overturning carefully arranged displays, scattering lightweight goods, and making it impossible to maintain the neat, attractive presentations that helped draw customers. Vendors selling cloth or lightweight items lived in constant fear of sudden gusts that could send their entire inventory flying through the streets. The lack of adequate shelter in most medieval towns meant that street vendors had few options when severe weather struck. Some larger markets had covered areas, but these prime spots were typically reserved for established merchants who paid higher fees. Street vendors were left to create their own makeshift shelters using whatever materials they could afford: scraps of cloth, pieces of wood, or animal hides that provided minimal protection against the elements. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval street vendors displayed remarkable ingenuity and resilience in their daily struggle for survival. They developed intricate knowledge of their local markets, learning which corners offered the best protection from wind, which times of day brought the most customers, and which products were most likely to sell in different weather conditions. Many vendors specialized in goods that were less susceptible to weather damage or spoilage, even if these items offered lower profit margins. Others learned to diversify their offerings, carrying a mix of products that could provide income regardless of conditions. Some developed relationships with indoor merchants, serving as informal suppliers who could provide goods during times when the established shops were closed or understocked. The social networks that street vendors created among themselves became crucial survival mechanisms. Information about profitable locations, dangerous areas, reliable suppliers, and changing market conditions flowed through these informal networks, helping individual vendors make better decisions about where to go, what to sell, and when to cut their losses and try again another day. These men and women, carrying their modest wares through the unpredictable streets of medieval towns, embodied a particular kind of courage, born from desperation and sustained by hope. They faced each day, knowing that their livelihood hung by the thinnest of threads, that a single stroke of bad luck could plunge them into destitution. Yet they persisted in their efforts to carve out a place for themselves in an unforgiving economic system. Their stories remind us that behind the grand narratives of medieval history, the wars and conquests, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the great works of art and architecture, lay the quiet struggles of ordinary people trying to make a living in circumstances that would challenge the strongest among us. In their persistence and adaptability, we see reflected the fundamental human drive to survive and thrive, even when the odds seem insurmountable. The Harsh Lives of Medieval Street Vendors, Part 5. As we delve deeper into the brutal realities of medieval commerce, we encounter perhaps the most vulnerable participants in this unforgiving economic landscape: the street vendors. These desperate souls represented the absolute bottom rung of medieval society's commercial hierarchy, existing in a precarious twilight between legitimate trade and outright destitution. Their stories illuminate the harsh truths of survival in an age where a single bad day could mean the difference between meager sustenance and starvation. The typical medieval street vendor possessed nothing more than what they could carry on their back or pile onto a rickety handcart. Unlike established merchants with their guild protections and permanent storefronts, these wandering traders operated entirely outside the formal economic structures that provided even minimal security to their more fortunate counterparts. They were the economic untouchables, scraping together whatever coins they could by selling society's unwanted remnants to those who could afford nothing better. Picture, if you will, the dawn breaking over a typical medieval town. As the church bells toll the morning hour, a hunched figure emerges from whatever shelter they manage to secure for the night. Perhaps a doorway, a stable, or if they were fortunate, a corner of an inn's common room purchased with their last remaining copper. This is Margot, a widow whose husband's death left her with nothing but debts and a fierce determination to survive. Her weathered hands clutch a woven basket containing her entire inventory: a few withered apples rescued from a merchant's refuse pile, some questionable strips of dried meat of uncertain origin, and several small clay vessels filled with what she optimistically calls healing salve, but which is little more than rendered animal fat mixed with common herbs. Margot's story exemplifies the desperate circumstances that drove people into street vending. The death of a breadwinner, the failure of a small business, exile from a guild, or simply being born into the wrong family could all lead to this hand-to-mouth existence. For women like Margot, widowhood was often a direct path to destitution. Medieval society offered few legitimate opportunities for women to earn a living independently, and those that existed were typically controlled by male-dominated guilds that jealously guarded their privileges. The merchandise these vendors offered tells its own story of desperation and resourcefulness. Fresh goods were far beyond their reach. Those went to established merchants with the capital to purchase quality inventory and the storage facilities to preserve it. Instead, street vendors dealt in the dregs of medieval commerce. They sold the bruised fruit that proper merchants discarded, the day-old bread that bakers couldn't move, the questionable cuts of meat that butchers couldn't guarantee. They peddled homemade remedies of dubious efficacy, crude trinkets fashioned from scraps of metal or wood, and whatever small services they could provide with their own two hands. The quality of these goods was often as questionable as their origins. Without proper storage or preservation methods, much of what street vendors offered was in various stages of decay. Fruit might be soft and beginning to rot, bread could be hard as stone or growing mold, and meat was frequently rancid or crawling with maggots. Yet desperate customers, driven by their own poverty, would still purchase these inferior goods because they represented the only options within their meagre budgets. Competition among street vendors was fierce and often brutal. Since they operated outside the regulated guild system, there were no established territories or agreed-upon practices. Vendors would fight viciously over the most promising locations, near church entrances where the faithful gathered, outside taverns where coins might flow more freely, or at the edges of established markets where they could catch the overflow of customers. These confrontations could turn violent quickly, with vendors using whatever weapons they could find to defend their precarious claims to a profitable spot. The relationship between street vendors and established merchants was one of constant tension and mutual suspicion. Guild merchants viewed these unlicensed traders as threats to their monopolies and profits. They complained to authorities that street vendors undercut their prices unfairly, sold inferior goods that damaged the reputation of all merchants and attracted undesirable elements to commercial districts. Many established merchants would go to great lengths to drive street vendors away from areas they considered their territory, sometimes resorting to hiring thugs to intimidate or assault them. Local authorities generally shared the established merchants' antipathy towards street vendors. These unofficial traders paid no taxes, held no licenses, and contributed nothing to the formal economic structures that towns depended upon. They were seen as parasites feeding off the legitimate commerce of proper citizens. Town guards would regularly harass street vendors, confiscating their goods on spurious charges, demanding bribes for the privilege of conducting business, or simply driving them away with threats of violence. The seasonal nature of medieval life hit street vendors particularly hard. During harsh winters, when travel was difficult and people had little money to spare, the already thin stream of potential customers dwindled to almost nothing. Vendors would huddle in whatever shelter they could find, slowly consuming their remaining inventory just to survive until spring brought the possibility of renewed trade. Many didn't make it through these lean months, succumbing to cold, hunger, or disease in anonymous deaths that went unrecorded and unmoaned. Disease was a constant spectre haunting the lives of street vendors. Their poor nutrition, exposure to the elements, and constant contact with contaminated goods made them prime targets for the various ailments that swept through medieval communities. A vendor who fell ill faced an impossible choice: continue working while sick and risk spreading disease to customers who might then refuse to buy from them, or rest and recover while their already meager income disappeared entirely. Most chose to continue working, creating a cycle where illness spread through the vendor community and then to their customers. The social isolation experienced by street vendors was perhaps as crushing as their physical hardships. Proper society viewed them with suspicion and contempt, seeing them as little better than beggars or criminals. They were excluded from religious services in better churches, denied entry to respectable establishments, and treated as pariahs by those only slightly higher on the social ladder. This isolation was particularly cruel because many vendors had once been part of respectable society before circumstances beyond their control drove them to the streets. Yet within this community of outcasts, bonds of solidarity sometimes formed. Vendors would share information about promising locations, warn each other about hostile authorities, and occasionally pool resources to help a colleague through a particularly difficult period. These informal networks provided the only social safety net available to people who had fallen through every other crack in medieval society. The inventory management challenges faced by street vendors were unlike anything experienced by established merchants. With no permanent storage and minimal capital, they had to carefully balance their purchases to ensure they could sell everything before it spoiled completely. A vendor might spend their last few coins on a batch of questionable fish, knowing they had only hours to sell it before it became completely inedible. The stress of these constant calculations combined with the physical demands of hauling goods through crowded streets, took a severe toll on both body and mind. Children born into vendor families faced particularly grim prospects. From the moment they could walk, they were pressed into service as unpaid labor, helping to carry goods, watch for authorities, and attract customers with their innocent faces. Education was completely out of reach, as was any hope of apprenticeship to a respectable trade. These children learned the harsh realities of medieval commerce from their earliest years, developing the sharp instincts and flexible morality necessary to survive in a world that offered them no legitimate opportunities for advancement. The relationship between street vendors and their customers was complex and fraught with mutual suspicion. Customers knew they were buying inferior goods, but had little choice given their own limited resources. They would examine every item minutely, haggling aggressively over prices that were already barely sustainable for the vendors. Trust was virtually non-existent. Customers assumed vendors were trying to cheat them, while vendors knew that customers would disappear the moment they found better options elsewhere. Payment was another constant challenge. Many potential customers had no coins at all, instead offering to barter with equally questionable goods or services. A vendor might accept a torn piece of cloth in exchange for spoiled fruit, hoping to find someone else who might value the fabric more than the food. These complex chains of barter created their own problems, as vendors found themselves holding inventory they never intended to acquire and couldn't easily dispose of. The legal status of street vendors was deliberately ambiguous, leaving them vulnerable to arbitrary enforcement and abuse. While not technically illegal in most jurisdictions, their activities existed in a grey area that authorities could interpret however served their interests at any given moment. A vendor might operate unmolested for weeks, only to suddenly find themselves arrested on charges of vagrancy, theft, or disturbing the peace. The lack of clear legal protections meant that vendors had no recourse when they were cheated, robbed, or assaulted by customers, competitors, or authorities. Weather represented another constant enemy. Rain would destroy any goods that weren't properly protected, while extreme heat would accelerate spoilage and drive away potential customers. Snow and ice made travel dangerous and reduced foot traffic to almost nothing. Vendors had to constantly adapt their strategies to accommodate conditions beyond their control, sometimes abandoning promising locations simply because the weather made them untenable. The psychological toll of this existence cannot be overstated. The constant stress of uncertain income, the humiliation of social rejection, and the physical demands of the work created a grinding despair that wore down even the strongest spirits. Many vendors turned to alcohol or other substances to numb their pain, further compromising their ability to conduct business effectively. The suicide rate among this population was likely significant, though such deaths would have been attributed to other causes or simply gone unrecorded. Despite these overwhelming challenges, some street vendors managed to display remarkable resilience and creativity. They developed ingenious methods for preserving questionable goods, created compelling sales pitches that could move even the most dubious merchandise, and built networks of contacts that helped them survive the worst periods. A few even managed to accumulate enough capital to transition into more legitimate forms of commerce, though such success stories were rare enough to be considered miraculous. The religious life of street vendors was complicated by their social status. While Christianity officially taught that all souls were equal in God's eyes, the practical reality was that vendors were often excluded from religious communities. They couldn't afford the donations expected of parishioners, their irregular schedules made it difficult to attend services, and their association with questionable goods made them unwelcome in respectable congregations. Many vendors developed their own folk religious practices, mixing Christian elements with older traditions and superstitions that promised protection from the dangers of their daily lives. As we examine the harsh realities faced by medieval street vendors, we see reflected the broader cruelties and inequalities of their age. These desperate traders were not criminals or lazily seeking easy money. They were people caught in circumstances beyond their control, struggling to survive in a system that offered them no legitimate alternatives. Their stories remind us that behind every economic transaction in the medieval world lay human drama, suffering, and the endless struggle for dignity in the face of dehumanizing circumstances. The legacy of these forgotten merchants echoes through history, reminding us that commerce has always been shaped not just by the grand strategies of wealthy traders and powerful guilds, but by the desperate innovations of those fighting for survival at the very margins of society. In their resourcefulness, their resilience, and their refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds, medieval street vendors embodied both the worst aspects of their age and the timeless human capacity to endure and adapt when faced with impossible circumstances. The Harsh Lives of Medieval Street Vendors, Part 6. As the mist lifted from the cobblestone streets each dawn, revealing puddles of waste and refuse from the previous day, the street vendors of medieval towns began their familiar ritual of survival. They emerged from cramped quarters where entire families slept on straw mattresses, sharing space with rats and fleas that carried disease from household to household. The vendors' faces bore the weathered marks of countless mornings spent in these unforgiving conditions, their hands already reaching for whatever meager goods they hoped to sell before the sun reached its peak. The sanitary conditions that surrounded medieval street vendors were nothing short of appalling by any modern standard. Open sewers ran down the centers of narrow streets, carrying human waste, animal refuse, and the rotting remnants of yesterday's unsold food directly past the very spots where vendors laid out their wares. The stench was overwhelming, a thick miasma of decay that clung to clothing and skin, becoming so familiar that vendors barely noticed it anymore. This was simply the reality of their world, where the concepts of hygiene and public health remained centuries away from discovery. Water, that most basic necessity of life, presented vendors with an impossible choice. The wells and rivers that supplied medieval towns were contaminated with the same filth that flowed through the streets. Vendors who needed to clean their goods, their hands, or their simple tools had no choice but to use this tainted water, unknowingly spreading disease with every interaction. Many vendors developed chronic stomach ailments, skin conditions, and respiratory problems from constant exposure to these polluted conditions. Yet they had no understanding of the connection between their environment and their declining health. The very food that vendors sold became a vector for disease in these unsanitary conditions. Meat left exposed to the air quickly attracted swarms of flies that had just been feeding on human waste and rotting garbage. Vegetables and grains absorbed moisture from the fetid air, becoming breeding grounds for bacteria and mold. Dairy products spoiled within hours in the summer heat, yet vendors had no choice but to continue offering them for sale, hoping to recoup even a fraction of their investment before the food became completely inedible. The lack of proper food storage created a vicious cycle of contamination and loss. Most vendors possessed only rough wooden boxes or woven baskets to protect their goods, containers that offered little defense against rain, dust, or vermin. Rats and mice considered vendor stalls their personal feeding grounds, contaminating far more food than they actually consumed. A single rat could destroy a vendor's entire day's inventory by urinating on produce or gnawing through containers. Yet vendors had no effective means of pest control beyond crude traps and the occasional cat. Personal hygiene among vendors was virtually non-existent, not through choice, but through circumstance. Most vendors owned only one set of clothing, which they wore continuously until it literally fell apart. These garments became repositories of grease, food particles, sweat, and grime, creating perfect environments for lice and other parasites. Bathing was a luxury that few could afford, both in terms of time and resources. Even if vendors could spare the hours needed to heat water and find privacy, soap was expensive and often unavailable to those at the bottom of the economic ladder. The communal nature of medieval sanitation affected vendors particularly severely. Public latrines, where they existed at all, were shared by hundreds of people and rarely cleaned. More commonly, people simply relieved themselves in alleys, against walls, or directly in the streets. Vendors, who spent their entire days in public spaces, had little choice but to conduct their most private business in full view of potential customers, adding humiliation to the long list of indignities they endured daily. Disease spread through vendor communities with terrifying speed and efficiency. When one vendor fell ill with dysentery, typhoid, or any of the numerous ailments that thrived in these conditions, their close proximity to others in the marketplace ensured rapid transmission. Vendors who were sick had no option to stay home and recover. Missing even a single day of sales could mean starvation for their families. So they continued to work while ill, coughing and sneezing over their goods, touching their wares with hands that trembled from fever, spreading sickness to customers and fellow vendors alike. The periodic outbreaks of more serious diseases, such as the bubonic plague, devastated vendor communities with particular brutality. The Black Death, which swept through Europe repeatedly during the medieval period, found ideal conditions in the crowded, filthy marketplaces where vendors congregated. The disease was carried by fleas that lived on the rats infesting every corner of medieval towns, and vendors, who worked at ground level surrounded by refuse and standing water, were among the most vulnerable populations. Entire families of vendors were wiped out in a matter of days, their stalls abandoned and their goods left to rot in the streets. Women vendors faced additional health challenges related to their gender. Pregnancy and childbirth in these unsanitary conditions were extremely dangerous, with maternal and infant mortality rates reaching horrific levels. Female vendors often gave birth in the same spaces where they sold food, assisted only by other women with no medical training. Postnatal infections were common and frequently fatal, leaving newborns orphaned and older children to fend for themselves in an already hostile environment. The water used for cooking and food preparation was a constant source of contamination. Vendors who sold prepared foods had no choice but to use whatever water was available, regardless of its quality. Stews and porridges were prepared with water that had already sickened countless people, while bread was kneaded with hands that had never been properly washed. The very act of preparing food for sale became a means of spreading disease throughout the community. Medical care for vendors was essentially non-existent. Physicians served only the wealthy, while barber surgeons, with their crude understanding of anatomy and medicine, were beyond the financial reach of most vendors. When vendors fell seriously ill, they relied on folk remedies passed down through generations, treatments that were often ineffective and sometimes actively harmful. Many vendors attempted to treat serious infections with poultices made from moldy bread or animal dung, unknowingly introducing additional pathogens into their wounds. The psychological toll of living in such conditions was immense, though rarely acknowledged or understood in medieval times. The constant fear of disease, the daily assault on the senses from overwhelming odors and sights, and the knowledge that any day could bring a plague that would wipe out entire families created a pervasive atmosphere of anxiety and despair. Vendors developed a fatalistic outlook, accepting sickness and early death as inevitable rather than preventable outcomes. Children born into vendor families faced particularly grim prospects. They were exposed to these appalling sanitary conditions from birth, their developing immune systems overwhelmed by constant assault from pathogens. Many died before reaching their first birthday, while those who survived often bore the permanent marks of malnutrition and disease. Childhood illnesses that would be minor inconveniences today became death sentences in the medieval world, and parents learned not to become too attached to their youngest children, knowing that the odds of survival were poor. The seasonal nature of vendor work meant that sanitary conditions varied throughout the year, but never improved significantly. Summer brought heat that accelerated the decomposition of waste and food, creating even more intense odors and higher concentrations of disease-carrying insects. Winter provided some relief from flies and other pests, but vendors were forced to huddle closer together for warmth, facilitating the spread of respiratory illnesses and other contagious diseases. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval street vendors developed remarkable resilience and adaptation strategies. They learned to recognize the early signs of food spoilage and disease, becoming experts at assessing risks that they couldn't fully understand. They formed tight-knit communities that provided mutual support during times of illness, with healthy vendors caring for the children of sick colleagues and sharing resources when possible. These informal networks of care and cooperation were often the only thing standing between vendor families and complete destitution. The legacy of these harsh sanitary conditions extended far beyond the medieval period, shaping social attitudes toward poverty, disease, and urban planning for centuries to come. The association between the poor and disease became deeply embedded in social consciousness, leading to discrimination and marginalization that persisted long after the underlying causes were better understood. The street vendors of medieval times, struggling to survive in conditions that would be considered uninhabitable today, unknowingly helped to establish patterns of urban development and public health policy that would influence city planning for generations. In examining the sanitary conditions faced by medieval street vendors, we witness not just individual suffering, but a systematic failure of society to provide even the most basic protections for its most vulnerable members. These men, women, and children who risked their health daily to provide food and goods to their communities deserved better than the appalling conditions they endured. Their stories remind us of how far we have come in understanding public health and sanitation, while also serving as a sobering reminder of what life can become when basic human needs are ignored or deemed unimportant by those in power. Looking at your script so far and the reference materials, I'll continue from where you left off with Part 7. Here's the continuation focusing on the daily survival struggles of medieval street vendors. The daily existence of medieval street vendors was punctuated by moments of desperate decision-making that would seem unthinkable to us today. When Agnes the fishmonger discovered that half her catch had spoiled overnight, she faced a choice that encapsulated the brutal reality of vendor life. She could discard the questionable fish and lose precious income her family desperately needed, or she could attempt to mask the spoilage with strong herbs and hope her customers wouldn't notice until after they'd paid. Agnes chose survival over honesty, as so many vendors did. She carefully arranged the fresher fish on top, buried the suspicious pieces beneath, and sprinkled everything liberally with dried rosemary and thyme. The aromatic herbs would disguise the smell long enough to make a sale. It was a gamble with her reputation, but reputation meant little if her children starved. This moral compromise was just one of countless ethical dilemmas that vendors faced daily. The line between survival and deception blurred when every unsold item meant another hungry night for the family. Thomas the bread seller regularly mixed sawdust into his flour during lean times, while Mary the alewife watered down her brew until it was barely recognizable as the hearty beverage it once was. These weren't the actions of inherently dishonest people, but rather the desperate measures of those trapped in an economic system that offered no safety net for failure. The physical toll of vendor life extended far beyond the obvious hardships of weather exposure and heavy lifting. The constant stress of financial uncertainty manifested in ways that medieval people could observe but not fully understand. Vendors aged rapidly, their faces etched with worry lines that spoke of countless sleepless nights spent calculating whether tomorrow's sales would cover the rent. Hair turned grey prematurely, teeth fell out from poor nutrition, and hands became gnarled from repetitive motions and exposure to harsh elements. Margaret the wool merchant developed a persistent cough that racked her thin frame each winter, a condition that modern medicine would recognize as chronic bronchitis, brought on by years of breathing in wool fibers and working in damp, poorly ventilated spaces. But in medieval times, such ailments were simply accepted as the inevitable consequence of one's station in life. There were no workers' compensation laws, no understanding of occupational health hazards, and certainly no retirement plans for those whose bodies could no longer sustain the demands of street vending. The psychological pressure was perhaps even more devastating than the physical hardships. Vendors lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, always watching for potential threats to their livelihood. A new vendor setting up nearby could spell disaster for established merchants. Changes in local laws or taxation could overnight transform a marginally profitable business into a guaranteed loss. The arrival of traveling merchants with superior goods could devastate local vendors who had spent years building their customer base. This chronic stress created a community of people who were simultaneously deeply interconnected and intensely competitive. Vendors would band together against external threats like aggressive tax collectors or hostile guild members, but would ruthlessly undercut each other when survival was at stake. Friendships formed over shared hardships could dissolve instantly when one vendor's success came at another's expense. The children of vendors inherited not just their parents' trades, but also their anxieties and survival strategies. Young ones learned to lie convincingly about the quality of goods, to spot potential troublemakers from across the marketplace, and to calculate profit margins before they could properly read or write. Childhood, as we understand it, was a luxury that vendor families could not afford. Children as young as 5 or 6 were expected to contribute meaningfully to the family's survival, whether through begging, pickpocketing, or assisting with sales. Little Emma, daughter of a candle maker, spent her days dipping wicks into tallow while her fingers grew raw from the hot wax. She dreamed of the warm bread she smelled from the baker's stall each morning, but knew that such luxuries were reserved for their customers, not for vendor families who lived perpetually on the edge of destitution. Her education consisted of learning which customers paid promptly and which required aggressive collection tactics. Knowledge that would serve her well when she inevitably inherited her parents' precarious trade. The seasonal nature of many vendor businesses created additional layers of uncertainty. Summer might bring relative prosperity for those selling fresh produce or cold drinks, but winter could be devastating for vendors whose goods were less essential. Ice vendors faced months of unemployment, while those selling warm food might thrive during cold weather, but struggle during summer months when appetites diminished and food spoiled more quickly. This seasonal uncertainty forced vendors to develop complex survival strategies that required them to think and plan like modern financial advisors. Despite having no formal education in such matters, they learned to hoard coins during good months, to diversify their offerings based on seasonal demand, and to maintain multiple income streams to weather inevitable downturns. A successful vendor might sell fruit in summer, roasted chestnuts in winter, and provide odd jobs during slow periods. The lack of reliable storage facilities created additional challenges that modern vendors couldn't imagine. Without refrigeration, vendors selling perishable goods lived in constant fear of spoilage. They developed intimate knowledge of their product's shelf life, learning to detect the earliest signs of deterioration that might not be apparent to customers. This expertise, born of necessity, made them inadvertent food scientists who understood preservation and spoilage in ways that wouldn't be formally codified for centuries. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval street vendors developed a remarkable resilience that allowed them to find moments of joy and community, even within their harsh circumstances. Markets became social hubs, where vendors shared information about successful sales techniques, warned each other about problematic customers, and provided emotional support during particularly difficult periods. These informal networks created a form of social insurance that helped vendors survive individual crises. The vendor community developed its own folklore and traditions that helped them cope with their difficult lives. Stories of vendors who had overcome impossible odds provided inspiration during dark times, while shared rituals and celebrations created bonds that transcended individual competition. Market day festivals, though modest affairs, offered brief respites from the grinding routine of survival and reminded vendors that they were part of a larger human community. Their resilience was perhaps most evident in their ability to maintain hope for future generations. Despite knowing firsthand the hardships of vendor life, parents continued to train their children in the trade, believing that the skills and knowledge they passed down would somehow lead to better opportunities. This optimism, in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, speaks to the fundamental human capacity for hope and the deep love that parents felt for their children, even when they had little material wealth to offer them. The legacy of these medieval street vendors extends far beyond their immediate historical context. Their struggles and adaptations laid the groundwork for modern commercial practices, labor rights, and social safety nets that we now take for granted. Their stories remind us that commerce, at its most basic level, is about human survival and the lengths to which people will go to provide for their families. In understanding their harsh lives, we gain perspective on our own commercial relationships and the privileges we enjoy in our modern economy. As we reflect on the lives of these forgotten entrepreneurs, we're reminded that behind every transaction, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, lies a human story of struggle, determination, and hope. The medieval street vendors who called out their wares in marketplaces across Europe were not just selling goods. They were fighting for survival, dignity, and the chance to build something better for the next generation. Medieval street vendors lived under the crushing weight of an unforgiving economic system that seemed designed to break their spirits. By the time our story reaches this point, we have witnessed their daily battles with poverty, violence, and disease. But perhaps the most insidious enemy they faced was the very foundation of their society itself, a rigid feudal structure that trapped them in cycles of exploitation with no hope of escape. The guild system, which dominated medieval commerce, created an almost impenetrable barrier between street vendors and legitimate prosperity. These powerful organizations controlled every aspect of trade, from the quality of goods to the prices they could command. To become a guild member required not just skill, but substantial fees, political connections, and often family lineage stretching back generations. For a street vendor, scraping together copper coins just to buy tomorrow's wares, such membership remained as distant as the stars. Master craftsmen jealously guarded their secrets and territories. A vendor selling bread near a guild bakery might find themselves accused of unfair competition or selling inferior goods. The penalties were swift and merciless: confiscation of goods, heavy fines, or even banishment from the marketplace. Thomas the baker, whom we met earlier struggling with his stale loaves, discovered this harsh reality when guild inspectors found sawdust mixed into his flour. The fine alone cost him 3 months of earnings, money he simply didn't have. Beyond the guilds lay an even more suffocating web of taxation and tribute. Medieval street vendors faced a bewildering array of fees and levies that seemed to multiply like weeds after rain. There was the market toll for the right to sell in the town square, the bridge tax for crossing into better neighborhoods, the cart fee for using wheeled transport, and countless other charges that local officials invented with creative enthusiasm. Consider the plight of Margaret, a widow who sold herbs and remedies from a small basket. Each morning, she paid the market sergeant for her spot near the church steps. If she moved to follow the crowds, she owed additional fees to different ward officials. When she purchased her herbs from rural farmers, she paid a gate tax entering the city. If she stored any goods overnight, there was a storage fee to the warehouse keeper. By the time she calculated all these costs, her profit margin had shrunk to almost nothing. The arbitrary nature of these taxes made planning impossible. A vendor might arrive at market to find new fees imposed overnight, or discover that yesterday's legal selling spot was now forbidden territory. Officials changed rules on whims, often targeting vendors who appeared to be doing well. Success itself became dangerous, as prosperity attracted the attention of tax collectors, like carrion birds to a corpse. Local authorities wielded their power with capricious cruelty. The market bailiff might demand bribes to overlook minor infractions, while the town watch extorted protection money from vendors working after dark. Those who couldn't pay found their goods mysteriously confiscated, or their permits suddenly revoked. Justice existed only for those who could afford to purchase it, leaving street vendors vulnerable to every petty official with a grudge or empty purse. The church, despite its teachings of charity and compassion, proved equally rapacious in its demands. Vendors were expected to contribute to religious festivals, pay for special masses, and support the local clergy's various projects. Failure to demonstrate proper piety through generous donations could result in accusations of heresy or moral corruption. In an age when religious suspicion could destroy lives, vendors had little choice but to empty their meager savings into church coffers. Even the physical marketplace itself conspired against their success. The best-selling spots, near the cathedral doors, close to the main thoroughfares, or under covered porticos, were reserved for established merchants who paid premium fees. Street vendors were relegated to muddy corners, narrow alleys, or exposed areas where weather could destroy their goods and customers rarely ventured. These prime locations weren't just about convenience, they were about survival. A vendor selling near the cathedral could catch parishioners before and after services, when their hearts were open and their purses accessible. Those forced to the market's periphery might wait entire days without a single customer, watching their perishable goods spoil while established merchants counted their profits. The seasonal nature of street vending added another layer of uncertainty to an already precarious existence. Summer brought opportunities to sell fresh produce, cold drinks, and festival goods, but it also brought competition from rural farmers flooding the markets with their harvests. Winter reduced both supply and demand, as customers huddled indoors and goods became scarce. Vendors had to survive months of reduced income while still paying the same fees and taxes. Weather posed constant threats that no amount of planning could fully mitigate. A sudden storm could destroy a day's inventory, while extended periods of rain kept customers away and ruined stored goods. Snow blocked roads, preventing vendors from reaching suppliers or customers. During the harshest winters, some vendors froze to death in their stalls, found clutching the goods they could never afford to abandon. The legal system offered no protection for vendors wronged by customers or competitors. Courts favored those with money and status, leaving street vendors with little recourse when cheated. A nobleman who took goods without payment couldn't be challenged by a mere vendor. Fellow vendors might steal each other's customers through undercutting or spreading malicious rumors, but formal complaints required resources that few possessed. Contract enforcement was nearly impossible for small vendors. Agreements with suppliers often relied on trust and handshakes, leaving vendors vulnerable when deliveries failed to arrive or goods proved defective. Without written contracts or legal representation, vendors had no way to recover losses or hold partners accountable. This uncertainty made it nearly impossible to plan ahead or invest in business growth. Social prejudice compounded these economic hardships. Street vendors occupied one of the lowest rungs of medieval society, viewed with suspicion and contempt by their social superiors. They were seen as barely above beggars, their profession associated with trickery, desperation, and moral corruption. This reputation made it harder to attract customers, secure credit, or gain the respect necessary for business partnerships. The constant struggle for survival created a culture of desperate competition among vendors themselves. Rather than banding together against their common oppressors, they often turned on each other, undercutting prices, spreading rumors about competitors' goods, or fighting over the best-selling spots. This infighting weakened their collective bargaining power and made them easier targets for exploitation by authorities and guilds. Credit was virtually impossible to obtain at reasonable rates. Moneylenders charged crushing interest that could trap vendors in cycles of debt lasting generations. A vendor who borrowed money to purchase goods during lean times might find themselves paying back triple the original amount if they could pay it back at all. Default meant losing everything: goods, tools, and often their homes. The lack of banking institutions or commercial insurance meant that every transaction carried enormous risk. Vendors had no way to protect themselves against theft, natural disasters, or economic downturns. A single bad day could wipe out weeks of careful saving, while a string of misfortunes could destroy families that had spent generations building their small businesses. Female vendors faced additional challenges in this male-dominated society. Women were often prohibited from certain types of trade, charged higher fees for market privileges, or subjected to harassment that their male counterparts avoided. Widows trying to continue their husbands' businesses found themselves excluded from supplier networks or forced to work through male intermediaries who took substantial cuts of their profits. The guild system's grip on skilled trades meant that street vendors were largely confined to selling basic necessities or second-hand goods. They couldn't compete with guild-protected craftsmen in quality or prestige, forcing them to focus on volume and low prices. This created a vicious cycle where they had to work harder for smaller margins, making it even more difficult to accumulate the capital needed to improve their circumstances. Innovation was not just discouraged, but actively suppressed. A vendor who developed a new product or improved technique might find themselves accused of violating guild privileges or traditional practices. Authorities preferred the predictable tax revenue from established systems over the uncertainty that innovation might bring. This stagnation ensured that vendors remained trapped in the same basic survival strategies for generations. Transportation costs ate into profits with relentless efficiency. Vendors who traveled between markets faced tolls at bridges, city gates, and territorial boundaries. Those who remained in one location missed opportunities to find better prices for their goods or access to different customer bases. Either choice carried significant financial penalties that successful merchants could absorb, but street vendors could not. The feudal system's emphasis on personal loyalty and obligation, rather than commercial law, created additional complications for vendors. They might be forced to provide free goods or services to local lords, participate in military campaigns, or contribute labor to public works projects. These obligations, while supposedly mutual, were rarely reciprocated with meaningful protection or assistance. Even success carried its own dangers. A vendor who managed to accumulate modest wealth might find themselves targeted for robbery, extortion, or trumped-up legal charges designed to separate them from their money. Authorities often viewed prosperous vendors as sources of revenue rather than contributors to the local economy, increasing pressure and scrutiny as profits grew. The psychological toll of this constant economic pressure cannot be understated. Vendors lived in perpetual anxiety, never knowing when the next crisis would strike, or whether they could survive it. This stress affected their health, their family relationships, and their ability to make sound business decisions. Many turned to alcohol or other escapes, further undermining their chances of success. Despite these overwhelming challenges, some vendors managed to carve out small niches of relative stability. They formed informal networks of mutual support, shared information about market conditions, and helped each other during emergencies. These relationships, built on trust and shared hardship, provided the only reliable safety net available to them. The most successful vendors learned to navigate the complex web of regulations and relationships that governed their world. They cultivated connections with sympathetic officials, found ways to provide value to guild members without directly competing, and developed reputations for honesty that attracted loyal customers. But these strategies required years to develop and could be destroyed by a single misstep or change in local politics. Religious festivals and market fairs provided occasional opportunities for exceptional profits, but they also brought increased competition and higher fees. Vendors had to balance the potential rewards against the costs of preparation, travel, and premium market charges. Many gambled their entire savings on these events, hoping for windfall profits that might carry them through leaner times. The seasonal migration of vendors following harvests, festivals, and trade routes created its own set of challenges. Constant travel was expensive and dangerous, but staying in one location often meant accepting lower profits and limited opportunities. Vendors had to choose between the security of familiar markets and the potential rewards of exploring new territories. As we witness these vendors struggling against systematic oppression, we begin to understand how their daily battles shaped not just their own lives, but the entire fabric of medieval society. Their persistence in the face of such overwhelming obstacles speaks to a resilience that bordered on the heroic. Tomorrow, we will see how some of these vendors fought back against the forces arrayed against them, and how their small acts of defiance helped plant the seeds of economic change that would eventually transform the medieval world. Medieval street vendors operated in a precarious world where survival depended not only on selling their meager wares, but on navigating an intricate web of social hierarchies, guild politics, and ever-changing regulations. While we've explored their struggles with poverty, disease, and violence, there's another layer to their hardship that reveals the true complexity of their existence: the psychological toll of living perpetually on society's margins. The mental burden these vendors carried was perhaps their heaviest load. Imagine waking each morning knowing that your very presence in the marketplace was barely tolerated. Street vendors existed in a legal grey area, neither fully accepted nor completely banned. They were the economic untouchables, performing necessary functions while being scorned by the very people who relied on their services. This psychological stress manifested in various ways throughout their daily lives. Many vendors developed a characteristic hunched posture, not just from carrying heavy loads, but from the constant need to appear smaller, less threatening to guild members and authorities who might view their presence as competition or disruption. They learned to read the subtle signs of approaching trouble, the way a guild enforcer's hand moved toward his purse to count bribes, or how quickly a crowd's mood could turn hostile when times were lean. The constant vigilance required was exhausting. A successful vendor needed to maintain awareness of multiple threats simultaneously: pickpockets eyeing their small profits, competitors seeking to undercut their prices, authorities looking for excuses to levy fines, and customers who might accuse them of shortchanging or selling inferior goods. This hypervigilance often led to a form of chronic anxiety that permeated every aspect of their existence. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and brief. Many vendors rose before dawn to secure the best spots, and those who sold prepared foods often worked late into the evening to prepare for the next day. The precious few hours of rest were frequently interrupted by nightmares about losing their stock to thieves or being permanently banished from their selling locations. The social isolation was perhaps even more damaging than the physical hardships. Street vendors were caught between worlds, too poor to associate with established merchants, yet their commercial activities separated them from the common laborers and artisans who made up their customer base. They were neither fully part of the merchant class nor completely accepted by the working poor. This liminal existence created a profound sense of not belonging anywhere. Family relationships suffered under these pressures. Vendor families were often forced to scatter during working hours, with children sent to beg or perform small services, while parents manned their stalls. The constant stress of economic uncertainty created tension within households. Arguments over spending priorities were common. Should they invest in better goods that might attract more customers, or save every penny for the inevitable lean periods? Women vendors faced additional psychological burdens. Beyond the general challenges of street selling, they had to navigate the particular vulnerabilities of being female in public spaces. They developed complex strategies for dealing with harassment, from positioning themselves near protective landmarks to forming informal alliances with other vendors who could provide assistance if needed. Many carried themselves with a defensive posture that became second nature, always ready to deflect unwanted attention while still appearing approachable to potential customers. The relationship between street vendors and established guild merchants was particularly psychologically complex. Vendors often harbored deep resentment toward guild members who seemed to live in luxury while vendors scrambled for survival. Yet this resentment was mixed with envy and aspiration. Many vendors dreamed of somehow earning enough to buy their way into a guild, though such social mobility was extremely rare. This psychological tension was evident in the way vendors interacted with guild merchants' customers. They had to appear respectful and deferential to people they often viewed as undeservedly privileged, while simultaneously trying to convince these same people to purchase from them rather than from established shops. The cognitive dissonance of this daily performance took its toll. Religious faith provided some psychological relief, but it was complicated by the church's often contradictory messages. While Christianity preached about the dignity of honest labor and charity toward the poor, the reality was that street vendors were often viewed as morally suspect. The church's emphasis on fixed social hierarchies suggested that vendors' low status was divinely ordained, creating additional psychological conflict for those struggling to improve their circumstances. Some vendors found solace in developing their own informal spiritual practices. They might carry small religious tokens or develop personal rituals around their work, blessing their goods at the start of each day, or offering silent prayers for protection and prosperity. These practices provided a sense of agency and hope in otherwise powerless circumstances. The psychological impact of constant uncertainty cannot be overstated. Unlike artisans or laborers who might have some predictability in their work and income, street vendors lived in a state of perpetual instability. Weather, political upheavals, religious festivals, market regulations, seasonal fluctuations, and countless other factors could dramatically affect their earnings from day to day. This uncertainty made long-term planning nearly impossible and created a perpetual state of anxiety about the future. Many vendors developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of chronic stress and depression. Contemporary accounts describe vendors who became increasingly withdrawn, suspicious of others, and prone to sudden outbursts of anger or despair. The constant struggle for survival left little mental energy for joy, creativity, or personal growth. The children of street vendors were particularly affected by these psychological pressures. Growing up in an environment of constant stress and uncertainty, they often developed premature maturity and anxiety. Many learned to suppress their own needs and desires to avoid adding to their family's burdens. The psychological patterns established in childhood often perpetuated the cycle of marginal existence into the next generation. Despite these immense psychological challenges, many vendors developed remarkable resilience and adaptive strategies. They created informal support networks, sharing information about market conditions, warning each other about threats, and sometimes pooling resources during particularly difficult periods. These relationships, forged in shared hardship, often became sources of genuine emotional support and community. Some vendors found ways to maintain dignity and self-respect despite their marginal status. They might specialize in particular goods or develop reputations for honesty and fair dealing that gave them pride in their work. Others used humor as a coping mechanism, developing wit and storytelling skills that entertained customers while also providing psychological release from daily stresses. The psychological toll of medieval street vending extended beyond individual suffering to impact entire communities. The presence of large numbers of psychologically stressed, economically desperate people created undercurrents of social tension that could erupt during times of crisis. Food riots, anti-establishment uprisings, and religious movements often found fertile ground among populations that included many marginal vendors and traders. Yet perhaps most remarkably, many of these vendors maintained hope despite their circumstances. They continued to believe that hard work, cleverness, and persistence might eventually improve their situations. This hope, however fragile, was essential to their psychological survival and represents one of the most admirable aspects of their resilience. The legacy of their psychological struggles reminds us that economic marginality has always been about more than material deprivation. The mental and emotional costs of living on society's edges, the stress, isolation, uncertainty, and loss of dignity, were perhaps the heaviest burdens these medieval street vendors had to bear. Their stories illuminate the full human cost of economic inequality and social exclusion, lessons that remain relevant in understanding marginalized communities throughout history and into our present day. Part 10. The brutal realities of earning a living on the streets. As dawn broke over the crowded medieval marketplace, the street vendors stirred from whatever meager shelter they had managed to secure for the night. Perhaps it was a doorway shared with rats and refuse, or a corner beneath a merchant's stall where the wind cut less sharply through their threadbare cloaks. For these forgotten souls, each new day brought the same relentless struggle: to earn enough copper coins to survive another 24 hours in a world that seemed designed to crush them. The hierarchy of street commerce was as rigid and unforgiving as any feudal system. At the top sat the established guild merchants with their stone shops and royal charters, their coffers heavy with silver, and their bellies round with plenty. Below them came the licensed traders who paid hefty fees for the privilege of setting up permanent stalls in the better sections of the market square. But at the very bottom, scraping by in the shadows and margins, were the unlicensed street vendors, men, women and children who hawked whatever they could find, make, or steal just to put a crust of bread in their mouths. These desperate souls faced persecution from every direction. The guild merchants despised them as unfair competition who undercut their prices with inferior goods. The licensed traders saw them as parasites who attracted the wrong sort of customer and drove away respectable buyers. The city authorities viewed them as a nuisance at best and criminals at worst, subject to arbitrary fines, confiscation of goods, and violent expulsion from prime-selling locations. Margaret the ragwoman understood this brutal reality better than most. For 15 years, she had wandered the narrow streets of London with a canvas sack slung over her bent shoulders, calling out in a voice made hoarse by decades of shouting, "Rags! Old clothes. Good coin for your cast-offs." Her weathered hands, permanently stained black from handling countless dirty garments, would sort through the discarded clothing of the wealthy, searching for items that could be cleaned, mended, and resold to those slightly less desperate than herself. The work was backbreaking and humiliating. Margaret would spend hours bent over rain barrels, scrubbing blood, vomit, and worse from garments that had been worn by plague victims, executed criminals, or simply the unwashed masses. The stench clung to her like a second skin, marking her as untouchable in a society already stratified by smell. Respectable citizens would cross the street to avoid her, covering their noses with perfumed handkerchiefs as if her very presence might contaminate them. But even this degrading labor was fraught with competition and danger. Other rag women would fight viciously over the contents of a promising midden heap, clawing and biting each other for the chance to claim a moth-eaten tunic or a pair of shoes with holes worn through the soles. Margaret bore the scars of dozens of such encounters. A missing tooth from when Agnes the Shrew had struck her with a wooden club, a permanent limp from the time she had been pushed down a flight of stone steps while fleeing with an armload of stolen rags. The authorities showed no mercy to those caught in such disputes. When the watch discovered two rag women fighting over a pile of discarded clothing, their solution was typically to confiscate everything, throw both women in the stocks for a day and night, and warn them that repeat offences would result in branding or exile. There was no appeal, no consideration of circumstance, no recognition that these women were fighting for their very survival. For those vendors who managed to accumulate a small stock of goods to sell, the daily routine was one of constant vigilance and crushing anxiety. They had to rise before dawn to claim the best spots, usually the areas where foot traffic was heaviest, but where guild merchants and licensed traders had not yet established dominance. This meant positioning themselves near the entrances to churches, just as morning prayers were ending, or at crossroads where country folk entered the city with their carts of produce. But even securing a prime location was only the beginning of the day's challenges. Street vendors had to be prepared to flee at a moment's notice when guild enforcers or city officials made their rounds. The lucky ones might receive a few minutes' warning from sympathetic passers-by or fellow vendors who had spotted the approaching authorities. The unlucky ones would find their meagre wares scattered in the mud, trampled by the boots of men who derived genuine pleasure from destroying the livelihood of those too poor to fight back. Old Henrik the pie seller had perfected the art of rapid retreat. His wooden cart was fitted with leather straps that allowed him to sling it across his back like a massive pack, transforming him from stationary vendor to fleeing refugee in a matter of seconds. He had memorized every alley, every hidden courtyard, every loose board in every fence that might provide escape routes when the authorities came calling. His meat pies, if the grey, gristly filling could truly be called meat, were barely edible. But Henrik had survived in the trade for over 2 decades through sheer cunning and an intimate knowledge of urban geography. The constant stress of this cat-and-mouse existence took a terrible toll on the vendor's physical and mental health. Many developed nervous twitches, constantly scanning the crowds for signs of approaching trouble. Others became paranoid and suspicious, viewing every customer as a potential informant and every fellow vendor as competition to be eliminated. The lucky ones simply grew numb to the daily humiliations, their spirits crushed into a state of dull acceptance that allowed them to endure, but never truly live. Sleep was a luxury that few street vendors could afford. Those without family or friends to provide shelter would spend their nights huddled in doorways, under bridges, or in the ruins of abandoned buildings. They slept in shifts when possible, taking turns to watch for thieves, rapists, or simply other desperate souls who might kill them for their few possessions. The winter months were particularly brutal, with frostbite claiming fingers and toes, and pneumonia cutting down the weak and elderly with merciless efficiency. Even those fortunate enough to have some form of shelter faced constant uncertainty. Landlords who rented space to the destitute charged exorbitant rates for hovels that respectable people wouldn't house their animals in. A single room might be shared by a dozen or more people, with straw pallets rotated in shifts so that bodies were always occupying every available space. Privacy was non-existent, sanitation was primitive at best, and disease spread through these cramped quarters like wildfire. Young Thomas the Apple Boy had learned these harsh lessons at the tender age of 7, when his father died of the sweating sickness and his mother was forced to send him into the streets to earn what he could. The boy would station himself near the cathedral steps with a small basket of bruised apples purchased from farmers who couldn't sell their damaged goods to more reputable buyers. His piping voice, calling sweet apples, fresh from the orchard, was a lie that everyone understood, but few questioned. The apples were neither sweet nor fresh, but they were cheap, and in a world where hunger was a constant companion, even bruised fruit could find buyers. Thomas quickly learned that success in the street vending trade had little to do with the quality of one's goods and everything to do with reading people and situations. He could spot a potential customer from 50 paces, the way they walked, the cut of their clothes, the expression on their faces all provided clues about their likelihood to purchase and their ability to pay. More importantly, he learned to recognize the various types of danger that stalked the streets. The guild enforcers with their leather jerkins and oak cudgels, the city watch with their distinctive steel caps and officious manner, the older street children who might try to steal his basket and his earnings. The boy also discovered that pity could be a powerful sales tool. His naturally small stature and undernourished appearance made him appear even younger than his years, and many customers would purchase his inferior apples simply because they felt sorry for him. Thomas learned to emphasize his poverty and vulnerability, affecting a slight limp and speaking in a voice made thin by genuine hunger. It was a degrading performance, but it meant the difference between eating and going hungry. But even pity had its limits. When times were particularly hard and food scarce, competition among child vendors became vicious. Thomas bore scars from encounters with other desperate children who had tried to steal his selling spot or his meager earnings. A broken nose from 8-year-old Sarah the bread girl, who had struck him with a stone when he refused to surrender his place near the church door. A jagged scar on his forearm from where 12-year-old Will the pie boy had slashed him with a rusty knife during a dispute over a dropped penny. The adult vendors offered little protection or solidarity to these child competitors. If anything, many resented the children for their ability to generate sympathy and their willingness to work for smaller profits. An adult vendor might need to earn 6 pence to afford a night's lodging and a bowl of thin stew, while a child could survive on 2 pence worth of stale bread and a corner to sleep in. This economic reality created bitter divisions within an already marginalized community, turning potential allies against each other in a desperate struggle for survival. The authorities exploited these divisions ruthlessly. City officials would offer small rewards to vendors who informed on their competitors, a few copper coins for reporting unlicensed trading, a bowl of soup for identifying stolen goods, a night in a warm cell instead of the stocks for providing information about planned gatherings or protests. These tactics created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and betrayal that made organized resistance nearly impossible. Yet even in this harsh environment, moments of genuine human kindness occasionally flickered like candle flames in the darkness. When old Henrik collapsed from exhaustion during a particularly brutal summer heatwave, it was his fellow vendors who carried him to shade and shared their precious water with him. When young Thomas was beaten and robbed by a gang of older boys, Margaret the ragwoman used her own meager earnings to buy him bread and tend his wounds. These acts of compassion were rare and small, but they represented the stubborn persistence of human decency in circumstances designed to crush it. The vendors also developed their own informal codes of conduct and mutual protection. Certain selling spots were understood to belong to specific individuals, and while these territorial claims had no legal standing, they were generally respected by the vendor community. Information about the movements of authorities was shared freely, with elaborate systems of signals and warnings that could clear an entire street of unlicensed traders in a matter of minutes. When one vendor was arrested or expelled, others might pool their resources to help their family survive until they could return or find alternative means of support. These networks of mutual aid were fragile and constantly tested by the pressure of survival. Trust was a luxury that few could afford, and betrayal was always a temptation when the alternative was starvation. But they persisted nonetheless. representing perhaps the only form of social organization available to those excluded from guilds, churches, and other formal institutions of medieval society. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created additional challenges for street vendors. Summer brought opportunities for increased trade as people spent more time outdoors and farmers brought fresh produce to market, but it also brought competition from country folk who could undercut urban vendors with genuinely fresh goods. Autumn was a time of preparation as vendors scrambled to accumulate warm clothing and preserved foods for the coming winter. Winter itself was a time of endurance, when only the hardiest and most resourceful could continue trading, while many others simply tried to survive until spring. Spring brought renewal, but also desperation, as vendors who had barely survived the winter emerged weakened and depleted, facing fierce competition for the renewed opportunities of the warmer months. The cycle was relentless and unforgiving, with each season bringing its own particular hardships and challenges. Through all of this, the street vendors maintained their humanity through stories, songs, and shared memories. In the brief moments when they could gather safely, they would tell tales of better times, sing folk songs that reminded them of their humanity, and share gossip and information that helped them navigate their dangerous world. These oral traditions served not only as entertainment, but as a form of cultural resistance, preserving values of dignity, community, and hope in circumstances designed to destroy them. The street vendors of medieval times were more than mere economic actors struggling to survive in a harsh marketplace. They were human beings who'd been pushed to the very margins of society, but who refused to surrender their humanity entirely. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, people find ways to maintain dignity, to care for one another, and to resist the forces that would reduce them to mere objects of exploitation. Their lives were indeed harsh beyond modern comprehension, but they were also marked by moments of courage, kindness, and stubborn persistence that speak to the enduring strength of the human spirit. In remembering their struggles, we honor not only their memory, but also our shared humanity and our obligation to create a world where such desperate circumstances are no longer necessary for survival. Word count, 2,156. Here is part 11 of the harsh lives of medieval street vendors. For all their struggles with corrupt officials and economic hardship, medieval street vendors faced perhaps their greatest challenge in the form of disease and medical crises that could devastate their already precarious livelihoods. In an age before modern medicine, even a minor illness could spell financial ruin for a vendor who depended on daily sales to survive. The bubonic plague, which swept through Europe repeatedly during the medieval period, represented the ultimate catastrophe for street vendors. When plague struck a city, trade ground to a halt almost overnight. Markets were abandoned, customers fled or died, and vendors who had invested their meager savings in perishable goods watched helplessly as their inventory rotted unsold. Those vendors who survived the initial outbreak often found themselves in communities where half the population had perished, leaving far fewer customers with money to spend. Beyond the Great Plagues, everyday illnesses posed constant threats to vendors' survival. A baker who broke his arm could not knead dough. A fishmonger with dysentery could not travel to the docks. A cloth seller whose eyes failed from years of working by candlelight might lose the ability to distinguish quality fabrics. Unlike guild craftsmen, who often had apprentices or family members to assist them, street vendors typically worked alone and had no safety net when illness struck. The unsanitary conditions of medieval cities made disease transmission inevitable for street vendors. They worked in close proximity to open sewers, rotting refuse, and contaminated water sources. Food vendors were particularly vulnerable as they handled products that attracted rats, flies, and other disease vectors. The same crowded market conditions that were essential for generating sales also created perfect breeding grounds for contagion. Medieval medical knowledge offered little hope for sick vendors. Most could not afford the services of trained physicians, who primarily served the wealthy. Instead, they relied on folk remedies, herbal treatments from local wise women, or the dubious ministrations of traveling charlatans who peddled miracle cures. Many vendors attempted to treat themselves with whatever ingredients they could afford, often with disastrous results. When vendors fell seriously ill, their families faced impossible choices. Should they continue operating the business despite the risk of spreading disease to customers? Should they close temporarily and lose vital income? Should they sell their remaining inventory at desperate prices to pay for treatment? These decisions often determined whether a vendor family would survive or join the ranks of the destitute beggars who haunted medieval streets. The psychological toll of constant exposure to death and disease weighed heavily on medieval street vendors. They witnessed the suffering of their customers, their neighbors, and their competitors on a daily basis. Funeral processions were a regular sight in medieval cities, and vendors often found themselves selling goods to families preparing to bury their loved ones. This constant reminder of mortality created an atmosphere of anxiety and desperation that permeated the vendor community. Some vendors developed superstitious practices in attempts to ward off disease. They might wear amulets, recite prayers over their merchandise, or refuse to serve customers who appeared sickly. Others turned to alcohol as a means of coping with stress and fear, though this often led to additional problems with judgment and financial management. The economic impact of disease extended far beyond individual illness. When plague or other epidemics struck, entire supply chains collapsed. Farmers stopped bringing produce to market, craftsmen ceased production, and trade routes were abandoned. Vendors who had built relationships with reliable suppliers suddenly found themselves unable to obtain goods to sell. Those who had extended credit to customers often discovered that their debtors had died, taking any hope of repayment with them. Disease also disrupted the informal networks that vendors depended upon for survival. When illness struck, the cooperative arrangements between vendors often broke down. A vendor who had agreed to watch a neighbor's stall might flee the city to escape contagion. Suppliers who had provided goods on credit might demand immediate payment out of fear that their customers would not survive to pay later. The social bonds that held the vendor community together frequently dissolved under the pressure of epidemic disease. Children of vendor families were particularly vulnerable to the health crises that plagued medieval cities. High infant mortality rates meant that many vendor families lost multiple children before they reached adulthood. Those children who survived often suffered from malnutrition and stunted growth, making them less capable of contributing to the family business. Parents faced the heartbreaking choice between feeding their children adequately and maintaining enough capital to keep their businesses operating. The few medical resources available to vendors were often more dangerous than helpful. Bloodletting, the most common medical treatment of the era, frequently weakened patients who were already malnourished. Herbal remedies were sometimes effective, but just as often poisonous, especially when prepared by inexperienced practitioners. Surgery, when attempted at all, was performed without anesthesia or understanding of sterile technique, leading to high rates of infection and death. Some vendors attempted to diversify their businesses as protection against illness-related financial ruin. A cloth seller might also trade in preserved foods that would keep if he became too sick to work for several days. A baker might teach his wife and children his trade, so they could continue operating if he fell ill. However, these strategies were limited by the small scale of most vendor operations and the lack of capital needed to maintain multiple product lines. Religious beliefs provided some comfort to vendors facing the constant threat of disease, but also created additional burdens. Many believed that illness was punishment for sin, leading to feelings of guilt and shame. Others spent precious resources on religious offerings and pilgrimages in hopes of divine protection. the Church's teachings about accepting suffering as God's will sometimes discouraged vendors from seeking medical treatment or taking preventive measures. The vulnerability of street vendors to disease had lasting effects on medieval urban society. The frequent deaths of vendors disrupted local food distribution systems and contributed to periodic shortages of essential goods. The constant turnover in the vendor population prevented the development of stable commercial relationships and hindered the growth of more sophisticated trade networks. The fear of contagion also reinforced social prejudices against vendors, who were often blamed for spreading disease through their mobility and contact with diverse populations. Despite these overwhelming challenges, some medieval street vendors displayed remarkable resilience in the face of health crises. They developed practical strategies for minimizing exposure to disease, such as avoiding certain areas of the city during outbreaks or trading only with trusted customers. They formed mutual aid societies that provided basic care for sick members and support for the families of those who died. They adapted their business practices to changing circumstances, shifting to products that were less perishable or more in demand during times of crisis. The experience of disease and medical crisis among medieval street vendors reveals the extreme fragility of life at the margins of medieval society. These men and women lived constantly on the edge of catastrophe, where a single illness could destroy years of careful planning and hard work. Their struggles illuminate the harsh realities of urban life in an age when medical knowledge was primitive and social safety nets virtually non-existent. Yet their persistence in the face of such overwhelming odds testifies to the fundamental human drive to survive and provide for one's family, even under the most adverse circumstances imaginable. Part 12. The Enduring Legacy. Despite the crushing hardships that defined their existence, the medieval street vendors of Scotland and across Europe left an indelible mark on history. Their story is not merely one of suffering, but of profound human resilience that shaped the very foundations of our modern world. These forgotten merchants, who hawked their meagre wares through muddy streets and crowded marketplaces, were unwitting pioneers of commerce. Without formal education or powerful patrons, they created the earliest networks of trade that would eventually evolve into the sophisticated market systems we know today. Their crude stalls and desperate bartering laid the groundwork for merchant guilds, banking systems, and international trade routes. The street vendor's legacy lives on in the bustling markets found in cities worldwide. From London's Borough Market to Istanbul's Grand Bazaar, the spirit of those medieval traders echoes through time. Their descendants learned to organize, to demand fair treatment, and to claim their rightful place in society's economic structure. Perhaps most remarkably, these vendors embodied an entrepreneurial spirit that refused to be extinguished by poverty or persecution. In an age when most people were bound to the land or locked into hereditary trades, street vendors chose mobility and independence over security. They risked everything for the chance to better their circumstances, teaching us that commerce and ambition can flourish even in the darkest times. Their story reminds us that behind every statistic of medieval poverty were real people with hopes, dreams, and an unshakable determination to survive. In honoring their memory, we celebrate not just their struggles, but their triumph over seemingly impossible odds.